Hi, I'm Taylor.
And I'm Allison.
And you're listening to
the Conscious Health Podcast. Hey everyone, and welcome back. On this week's episode, we will be discussing the macromolecule protein and all the different protein alternatives.
Yeah, so I'm looking forward to discussing this with you. I did want to start off by saying I am kind of going to play devil's advocate in this episode. You know, Allison's going to talk about the different sources, and I'm going to question everything and add my 2 cents. And then I think in the end, we'll talk about our personal interaction and consumption patterns around protein alternatives, because we both don't consume meat-based protein. So I think we'll have an interesting perspective on this topic. But anyway, where did you want to start?
All right, so I think I'm going to start by introducing the macromolecule protein, just talking a little bit about it.
Sure.
So basically, protein is an essential macronutrient that is found throughout our bodies in various places, such as muscle, hair, tissues. It makes up also enzymes that power different chemical reactions in our body. And it also is part of hemoglobin, which helps carry oxygen throughout our bodies in blood.
Yeah, so the reason why we are covering protein actually is because of its importance. Is good for maintaining health, but also the main driver of us talking about protein is its energy intensiveness and how that affects the sustainability of protein and the forms of food that we extract protein from, and the types of foods that we consume in order to get our proteins is highly linked to environmental sustainability and food security with the growing population. So I think it's an important topic. It's actually a very hot topic also at the university because we have a lot of food innovation here. So they are looking at the health implications of protein sources, the environmental and the sustainability, and also the developmental and economic impacts of these protein sources and alternative protein sources.
So do we want to briefly talk about the different sources of protein and some of the alternative sources?
Sure.
All right, so I think one of the most common sources for protein, and the first thing that people think of, is going to be meat, poultry, and fish. So those are probably the most common sources. Following that would be eggs, dairy products, and then later on nuts, legumes, beans, soy products.
There's some fungus-based meat alternatives. Yeah, so there's been a lot of innovation recently, mostly in plant-based alternatives, but also there's, insect-based proteins, and people are looking at cultured meats, which is all really interesting. And there's also a spectrum in each of those, right? So from non-processed to ultra-processed vegetable alternatives, and fungus-based and insects have really gained a lot of attention, I think because of the composition and also the novelty. Like it's pretty new, and lab meat has been a huge talk in the last couple of years. So there's about 13 basic food types in this meat and alternative world. So your fruit and vegetable sources of protein, so nuts, peas, beans. You have your processed non-animal substitutes like tofu, wheat gluten or seitan, and mycoprotein, which is from fungus. And then your novel alternatives are cultured meat, insects, and algae, so like spirulina and that.
Oh, that's super cool.
Yeah. So those are mainly what have been studied and are of recent innovation. So maybe we can go over the health implications of all of these products first.
Sure. Okay, so clearly there's many different sources of protein, but where the protein is coming from can have an effect on your health. One of the biggest things would be eating processed red meats. That does increase the risk of heart disease and stroke. The World Health Organization recently came out with a statement a couple years ago saying to decrease the consumption of red meat due to the fact that it can have cancer-causing agents in it and increase the risk of heart disease and stroke. Red meat as well, just decreasing your consumption. Any sort of animal-based product is going to contain higher levels of cholesterol and saturated fat. On the other hand, plant-based proteins are often more unsaturated, so they can actually contribute to lowering LDL cholesterol in the body, which is the bad cholesterol.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too. I don't know where insects fit on that scale. I guess I'd consider it more on the animal side, but it is high in cholesterol and sodium, which I didn't realize until looking into this further.
Yeah, no, I didn't realize either that it was so high in sodium and cholesterol.
In terms of the healthiest of the alternatives, peas and the fungal-based proteins seem to have the most health benefit, followed by beans, wheat, jackfruit, tofu, and then insect, with respect to switching those out for a meat product. Ultimately, switching from beef, especially a processed red meat, switching to any alternative would have a beneficial health impact in some way. But did you want to talk about the environmental impact of all these alternatives? Because I think that's one of the biggest implications of altering your dietary choices with respect to protein sources.
Definitely. So in terms of the environmental aspect of these different protein sources, all these different sources of protein do have environmental impacts as well. Of course, all the animal-based protein sources, so the meat, the poultry, eggs, and various dairy products as well, they all contribute to a large production of methane gas.
Also, land use and agricultural runoff and pollution.
Also, insects have a very low carbon footprint. You can mass produce them in very small spaces as well. So it is kind of an ideal option for an area that might be very urbanized and there's not a lot of agricultural land space. This could be an alternative.
I also wanted to touch on the emissions of the other sources. So the least emission intensive would be nuts, followed by wheat, and then insects. So it's really low, and it's even lower than beans.
And this is like in terms of emissions?
Yeah, so this is based on emission intensity of CO2.
Okay.
Per 200 calories.
Oh, okay.
So what was really interesting too, which I didn't realize, so considering emissions, beef is the most intensive, and then second is cultured beef. And from what I've read, that's because it's so new, it's done on such a small scale. It's still a very intensive process. So there's a high energy requirement. And I guess the medium that they grow the lab cultured meat in is very energy intensive. And then also the mycoprotein, the fungal based protein, is about half as intensive as the cultured beef. But
really?
Yeah, it's very intensive still. I think because the electricity demands, I guess, for creating these fungal proteins is really high.
Oh.
That's the biggest contribution to the emissions.
Okay.
So it's even more emission intensive than chicken.
Oh, whoa.
Yeah, that was shocking.
Yeah,
for me,
that's really surprising. But I guess you have to like factor in all the different processes.
Yeah, and it's interesting how we can kind of pull this all together, the health and the emissions, to find the best alternative. Because like I had said, mycoprotein might be the healthiest, but it's still fairly energy intensive.
Right.
Or insects do have a considerable amount of cholesterol and sodium. However, they don't require a lot of energy for the cultivation.
Yeah, I think that kind of goes into the next idea of sustainability as well.
Yeah.
Which is obviously a very important consideration when looking at various protein sources and alternative protein sources. So I think that one of the biggest driving forces behind finding these alternative protein sources is sustainability.
Yeah.
Because our population is growing exponentially. And in order to be able to feed everyone, we're going to have to find some alternatives. Like, it's just not possible to continue eating the way we are. And so having these massive farms that are mass producing cows and chickens, it's just not sustainable, both environmentally and the land use. So we definitely have to be looking into alternatives.
Yeah, North America and Europe has seen a huge increase in the consumption patterns and also the development of meat alternatives.
However, the United Nations does estimate that the demand for meat is going to increase within the next 30, 40 years or so, which kind of, in a way, seems kind of backwards, because in our community, at least in a westernized community in Canada, it's definitely increasing the amount of people that identify as vegan, vegetarian, flexitarian. But if you think about it globally, it does make sense. Our population is increasing exponentially.
The reduction that we've seen has not been enough to compensate for the exponential population growth combined with the developing countries.
Right.
With that development comes prosperity and a higher intake of meat.
Right.
I think with the sustainability, though, maybe touching on the insect part and also food waste. So one thing is not only energy intensiveness, but the conversion of those calories and agricultural crops to beef.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a turnover there, and it's very high. We use so much land for beef, but insects can actually be fed the waste products or byproducts of animal feed. Not only do they emit less carbon, but they also reduce waste.
Yeah, I think that's really good because it's kind of killing two birds with one stone.
Yeah.
Am I allowed to say that?
Are you vegan?
Working on two different problems at once.
Exactly,
So
yeah.
I think that's really, really neat.
Maybe going off sustainability, but more internally or population focused, is the food prices
Right.
of all of these products based on energy intensiveness, but also the technological intensity of creating and developing these innovative products. It kind of goes without saying that cultured beef is the most expensive, and insects are second most expensive.
Really?
Just thinking about the sustainability and the fact that they can survive on the waste products, I'm wondering why that price incongruency is there. I don't know. It doesn't seem to make sense. And then the most cost effective would be wheat. So the relatively low price of some of the animal products, which seems counterintuitive, is actually because of decades of industrialization focused on making it more efficient.
Okay.
That's why some of the meats are
So low
at this point. And also innovation in plant-based alternatives is still new, and there's been a lot of money involved that the price is a little bit more.
I know that some of the CEOs of these different meat alternative companies that are producing, veggie burgers, they're trying to get it so that it's on an equal playing field with meat, especially in terms of how much it costs and the pricing of it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that has to do with the scale that they're working at right now. Meat-based industrialization has been going on for a long time. It's well established and it's very efficient, but there's so much money going into all these alternatives investment-wise with plant-based proteins, or there's always, a big company like Maple Leaf or Nestle who's investing or innovating in this space. So I think it's just going to grow from here, and then with that, prices should drop.
Industrialization and the scale at which these products are produced is, I think, one of the biggest gaps. That's where the plant-based alternatives are falling behind, is just that they can't produce at such a large scale right now.
Yeah.
Even lab-grown meat, all of that has been done on a very small scale. And even currently, the different companies that are working towards creating this, all of it is at very small quantities. For example, there's a company in San Francisco in California, and they're working towards creating lab meat. However, right now, the largest thing that they can create is a chicken nugget. It's difficult for them to create larger quantities and larger sizes of this meat. I don't know, how do you feel about cultured meat and lab meat? Would you ever eat it?
Personally, no. So the composition is the same as meat.
Right.
And I see that from a culinary perspective, maybe that might be attractive. But for me, eating the plant-based options is usually a whole food choice because it's low in saturated fat and low in cholesterol. So for me, that doesn't appeal. What about you?
Yeah, kind of the same thing. It doesn't really appeal to me. I haven't had meat in so many years now, but I do see how it can appeal to certain people. But I think it's tricky as well because it is grown in a lab, and I think people kind of get the wrong idea. They're like, oh, it's grown in a lab, and they get turned off by it. But they don't realize that it's literally the same composition, or at least that's what these researchers are working towards, is trying to make it the same composition as if you were to get it from the actual animal itself.
Yeah, I guess my concern with it would be, who are you targeting? So I don't see a lot of vegans being super gung-ho about eating lab meat. I think the texture might be repulsive for some vegans and vegetarians because a lot of them chose not to eat meat, not only for the animals, but because of their dislike for it.
Right. I think it really depends as to what their motivation was behind becoming vegan, vegetarian, pescatarian. Because if it was for environmental reasons, for example, and the these like companies were able to create a meat product, right,
Yeah.
that's more sustainable, more environmentally friendly, then I think that there would be people there that they would be able to target. But I think it's difficult because it's grown in a lab. And like I was saying, people get turned off the second they hear, oh, it's grown in a lab. They're like, that's not real. But it is. They take stem cells from the actual animals and culture them.
I just think the acceptance from meat eaters would be very low.
And also not just meat eaters, people in the agricultural industry, because that's taking away a lot of jobs, people's livelihoods. I think there would have to be a lot of pros associated with this lab-grown meat to get people to consume it. And like one of the big things would probably be the taste and the texture. If you're replicating something like this, you want it to be as close as possible to the actual thing.
That would take a lot of education.
Getting the texture right is very tricky, as well as the composition, because it is made of the same things. However, like since you're taking stem cells, you need to encourage them to differentiate into certain types of cells to get the right ratio of like fat and protein, right? So that's like very tricky. And then also to encourage these cells to grow, they have to be in like a very specific environment, and they have to be treated with different gases at the same amount that they would be in the actual animal. So it's just like, it's super hard to get the right consistency and the right texture, the right taste. And I think the product ends up being like so similar to meat, but not actually the same. I don't think people are going to buy into it.
Like I was saying, it's not that sustainable.
Right.
Like it's not making that much of an impact on sustainability, which is my biggest concern.
You know, kind of like what we talked about on last episode, it's this like novel idea. And so it's been blown up by the media being like, this is our next step in terms of sustainability. And
I think I'm going to play devil's advocate now, if you're okay with that.
I'm ready.
Okay. So just to start, when I was going through all the information, all these articles and the data, these are kind of some of the questions I had. And actually, it might be relevant for me to kind of touch on this. There was a systematic review on sustainable protein consumption. So before I go into my personal questions, I'm going to go into, I think this was based in Europe. So this is a population. What as a population are people saying? So the main highlights were that consumers underestimated the environmental impact of meat consumption. I don't think people are realizing the sheer impact that their meat consumption is having.
I agree with that.
Their willingness to change their meat eating behavior is very low. Their willingness to replace meat with other substitutes like insects or cultured meat is very low as well, which we kind of touched on. People are questioning it, and people aren't really on board at this point. So I kind of want to touch on that, and these are some of the questions that I had come up with. So the first one, why would I buy an alternative product? So is it health, flavor, sustainability for the animals?
I think personally, like it would be a combination of all those factors. I think one of the big things would probably be the health and the flavor of it, because you had mentioned that study where people underestimated the impact that meat had on the environment. And I don't think people realize the environmental impact unless they can see it firsthand. Not that people don't care about it, but I don't think that's the first thing that crosses people's mind when they decide to change to a meat alternative. I think it would be probably health and the flavor. So if someone like a health professional like that told someone, you know, you need to change your diet up a little bit, I think that could be a driving factor behind someone changing to an alternative protein source, as well as the taste. Because really, like, I think the taste is one of the biggest things regardless, is because people are so used to eating meat. So if they're going to change to something else, they want something that's going to taste the same, be the same texture, allow them to cook with it the same way that they did with meat. So I think if we can make products that are healthy and taste good, then I think we would be able to kind of push more people towards buying an alternative protein source.
I agree with that. My question to you would be, are these healthy? Are these alternatives healthy?
I think some of them, yes, but also at the same time, a lot of them that are currently out there are probably highly processed. You know, in order to get something like a plant to turn into a burger, there's got to be like a few steps at least in between that.
I completely agree with that.
Yeah, like there's no way for it to be completely unprocessed.
What would be the purpose then of mimicking meat? Is it for the taste? Is it for vegans? Is it for nostalgia? Or is it to convert people? to veganism? Like, who do you think this target, and do you think it effectively targets the right people?
Honestly, like I think like mimicking meat would be to target people who are either vegetarian or vegan, and they went vegetarian or vegan because of the environment, and they want to have a smaller carbon footprint, and they want to live more sustainably. And also for people who are kind of looking into other sustainable options but still enjoy the taste of meat. So I think it'd be like targeting those types of people, because obviously like there are some people who've been vegan or vegetarian for many years and these products wouldn't appeal to them. So I think it's for a specific population, at least for now. So it would be people who went vegan or vegetarian for environmental reasons potentially, and are looking, still like the taste of meat and are looking for something like that.
So going off of that, the Beyond Meat, I think it has been effective. Because
I agree.
I know people who eat meat who actually prefer that burger.
Yeah.
So I think it is also converting people who are eating meat and trying to get them to accept an alternative. It says there's a low acceptance or willingness to change, but I think that when there are options, at least if they do make the choice of wanting to change, it will make it easier.
Yeah, and I think also, even though you were saying that study has a low acceptance rate, but if you think about it globally, even if there is a very small acceptance rate, for example, like how many billions of people are on this planet, even if it's 1% of them, like 1% of a billion is still a lot of people. You're going to want more people to kind of convert or whatever, but...
Well, I was going to say, is that enough to save the planet?
Oh man, that's a tough question. I feel like probably not.
I don't think we can answer that right now. I don't know if anyone can, but yeah, I get that. It's a tough topic, and I think we'll see how it goes in the next couple of years, because this is all new to a lot of people. It is more readily available.
I think that's also a big thing. Like, it has to be accessible and available to people, because if it's not, like, they don't have the option, they're not going to go out of their way to get a new product that they've never had before.
Yeah.
Right? So it needs to be accessible and available.
We also mentioned the expense. So at this point, it is also more expensive, which definitely impacts the conversion rate. Okay, so I have a couple more questions. I'm trying to think, which one do I go for first? Okay, I think I'm going to go for this one. Why don't I just eat beans and tofu?
Oh, man. I feel like that's a tough question, and
I think it's really a personal question for everyone to kind of consider.
Yeah, I agree totally. Me personally, like, I do sometimes eat, as I was eating like 5 chicken nuggets yesterday, like vegan chicken nuggets.
You do?
No, so I do buy meat alternatives. I think the products that I usually purchase don't tend to be mock meat exactly. So it's not trying to be meat. It's like somewhat similar, I guess. But even like the veggie burgers and things I consume, like you can see that there's vegetables in it. It's made of vegetables or beans.
One thing with why not just eat beans, a lot of people in North America don't even know how to prepare beans or flavor beans and make dishes that surround beans. So I think the alternatives can really be convenient for them in transitioning, because it's familiar.
Exactly. I think convenience is a huge thing, familiarity, and also just like you were saying, not knowing how to incorporate beans.
Yeah. This last little prompt, I'm going to call it, was actually sparked by a friend from the Netherlands. So she came here on exchange and she said, your meat alternatives, they're horrible. So I asked her, well, what do you have, in Europe? And their alternatives are not trying to mimic meat. And I wish we would do this more. And I think there's room for it in the market. I really do. But it's alternatives that are not trying to mimic the texture or the flavor. It's just, it has an enhanced flavor. It's unique. And it actually drives people to consume it because they don't feel like they're missing something. So it's not, oh, I'm trying to mimic this, but it's not quite there. This is a whole new thing. It's unique. It's flavorful. It's interesting. And I think there's a market for it. And I'm hoping in the future that that would become more popular. And I think there is definitely innovation around this. But if they could combine the health and try and make it whole foods and it's made with real ingredients that people aren't questioning what's in this, and
Right.
it kind of can eliminate that but also bring people to appreciate those alternatives more and appreciate plant-based proteins more.
Right.
Because they're very well prepared and thought out.
No, I agree. I do think that there's a market for these alternatives that are not mock meat alternatives. But I think also part of the reason why we don't really have products like that is because this whole idea of plant-based protein, it's only blown up within the past couple years or so.
Yeah.
Before this, chain restaurants, fast food chains, none of those places had any sort of plant-based alternative. So it's only been within the last couple years. And so I think because of that, it's such a new idea of this mock meat or fast food places offering these types of things, which is why I don't think we have other novel foods that are protein alternatives as opposed to just like mock meat.
Yeah.
But I think once it kind of dies down a little bit and it's not as trendy anymore, then maybe like we'll be able to start creating other protein alternatives as opposed to just these mock meat. Because I do know what you mean. Like every time I go out to eat somewhere, even if I go to a restaurant that's marketed as vegetarian or vegan, all of the products that they have are always some sort of mock meat.
Yeah, it's always trying to mimic. I'm like, personally, that's not what I'm looking for.
In a way, I think it's kind of smart that they're trying to mimic meat.
Well, yeah, I think there's room for both, for sure.
But I think it is kind of a smart idea in terms of marketing and things like that, just because sometimes maybe someone will go vegan or vegetarian and then miss a certain food. So I think what a lot of these places are trying to do is recreate those comfort foods. So I think that's kind of why we're missing the protein alternatives that aren't mock meat.
Yeah, it's targeting nostalgia and then conversion of meat eaters. Yeah, I guess in the infancy stage, I understand that. And yeah, I completely agree with your point on that.
But I think it would be definitely cool to see in the next couple of years some different products that you can buy that aren't necessarily mock meat, but are just an alternative protein source that's plant-based.
Yeah, I'm hoping so too. I think we kind of already touched on what we do personally and interact with. You said you do consume some of those products.
Yeah.
I don't at all. I almost exclusively get my protein from beans, nuts, seeds, grains. And sometimes tofu. Pretty rare, though.
Is there like a specific reason as to why you avoid these products? Is it taste, health?
The mock meats and stuff? It's health. I've never tasted any. So I can't speak on taste, but it's mostly health. I don't know if everyone's listened to all the previous episodes, but I have kind of touched on me having a health condition. So I do have an autoimmune disease. So a lot of processed things are very triggering.
Right.
And with all the different ingredients, I have no idea how I would react to each one. So I just try and avoid it. And it works for me. And beans make me feel good. So, I just stick to that.
Honestly, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's like my personal decision. But it's not like I think mock meats are horrible. I don't think they're health promoting. I think there are healthier options. But I think there is a place for all of these options. I do think, though, that the beans and the nuts, just based on combining health, sustainability, economics, and carbon footprint, I think there are certain plant proteins that we should be focusing on. I think it could be really great, though, if we could combine all these issues of sustainability and that and come up with the best solution and a really innovative, tasty, effective product.
I definitely agree.
Maybe we can create it.
Yeah.
We are in NANS, like.
Yeah. Honestly, like kind of a cool project.
Yeah.
Yeah. Catch us working on that.
Bring it to Becker.
Yeah.
Okay, well, was there anything else you wanted to touch on for today's episode?
I think we covered most of what I was kind of looking to talk about. I think if there's one thing that we can all agree on is that there needs to be some sort of change in terms of our protein consumption, in terms of where we are getting these protein sources from.
Yeah, I think we need to be more conscious about our protein sources.
I agree. And I think most most people can agree on that. It's just not sustainable. Our population is growing. Like, we need the land space for other things.
Yeah, we really need to get on board and start the change now.
And even in terms of carbon emissions, all sorts of things. There's just so many factors that play into where our protein comes from and how we're sourcing our protein. And I think it's important that we're taking a look at all of these factors and realizing that something has to change in order to sustain our population.
I think, too, maybe one takeaway for everyone is go try an alternative.
Yes.
Or, get some beans and look up a recipe. Try and find something you like. There's a lot of ethnic cuisines, and you can really bring a lot of flavors, and you can discover new flavors. So I think that might be a good takeaway is, one, be conscious of your protein sources, because it has a huge impact on our planet and our, global community.
Definitely.
And explore those alternatives. That's the best you can do, and try to make that change. You want to end it here?
Sure.
Sounds good. Okay.
All right. Thanks so much for listening to this week's episode. We hope you guys enjoyed hearing all about protein, and that you think back to this podcast the next time you're doing your grocery shopping or at a restaurant. Don't forget to like and subscribe so that you can stay tuned for next week's episode.
See you next week.
Bye.